Welcome to our broadcast. We had promised you an interview with Billy Joel tonight. We will broadcast that conversation, which took place earlier this afternoon, tomorrow evening. This evening, we'll examine the unexpected retirement of basketball superstar Michael Jordan. We'll also have an interview I recorded earlier with actor Nigel Hawthorne. He is presently starring in The Madness of King George III. But first, anyone interested in the great artist of this age, not to mention the slam dunk, felt a huge loss today as the world's most formidable athlete, Michael Jordan, bowed out of basketball. In Chicago, children wept, and 400 members of the toughest audience around, the basketball press, gave Jordan a standing ovation. But the three-time champion and Olympic gold medal winner said he wanted to leave at the top of his game and get on with his life.
You know, I don't have any reservations about stepping away from the spotlight. The spotlight's been very, very good to me. Hopefully I've been good to it. It's been very something that many people don't encounter. You know, and I've encountered it, and certainly I've enjoyed it. But at some point in time, you just got to change ships. And I was watching George Brett when he was talking about his retirement, and he had one interesting scenario. And he said that if you ride a roller coaster for 9 years, don't you want to ride something else? And that's where I feel right now. I've been on this roller coaster for 9 years. It's just time for me to ride something else.
Joining us now to talk about the shock to the sports world is Bob Costas of NBC Sports, New Jersey Nets coach Chuck Daly, who coached Jordan at last year's Barcelona Olympics, New York Post basketball columnist Peter Vecsey, and via satellite from Chicago, Bob Greene. His book, Hang Time, is a story of the 2 years that Bob Greene spent with Michael Jordan. I'm pleased to have all of you here to talk about this. Tell me, did you expect this? Do you have any inkling that this might be coming?
I had a phone call, I'd say maybe 3 weeks ago, and a person...
Michael?
No. And a person alluded to it, and I said, yeah, no, I understand the problem, some of his problems, particularly having won 2 back-to-backs, being involved in that, and going back to camp. I said to a friend of mine last week, I said, how in God's name can they go back to camp again after being together for 3 years, that length of time?
Let me go to Bob Greene. Bob, you haven't talked to Michael, correct?
No, not since
today, in the last week or so.
No.
Did you have any inkling this was coming?
Yeah, I mean, no one could have predicted the exact date, but with Jordan, the trick is not to analyze what he says or guess what he might really mean. With Jordan, you ought to just listen to what he says. He's been telling us for years that when he gets out, it's going to happen so quick that we won't believe it. And these last couple of years have not been a very happy time for him. And obviously the tragedy last summer with his father added to that. But even before that, Jordan always said that he wanted to get out of basketball here. Not here, but here at the very top. And I remember him saying once that what would hurt him the most is if he looked up in the stands at some point and he thought that maybe some of the fans were saying to each other, you know, Jordan's a step slower than last year. Or they might say, I wish Phil Jackson would take Jordan out just for a few minutes to get somebody else in there. He knew he would never be booed, especially in the Chicago Stadium. But he said, as much as he loved basketball, it would be less painful to walk away from basketball than to continue playing and know that the fans were starting to feel a little sorry for who Jordan used to be. So when you put all those things together, what he told us for years is, when I go, it's going to be so quick you won't believe it. And today he did it.
You told me earlier, Bob, before we went on the air, that it was not the 2.5 hours of basketball. While he said I didn't have anything to prove, while he said I still love the game, it wasn't the game. It wasn't the fact that he still wanted to win, that he was still competitive. All of that's still there. It was the rest of the stuff. What's the rest of the stuff?
See, I think if for the 2.5 hours of playing basketball every night, that's fine for Jordan. He could do that forever. I kept thinking this year, if he were to have gone around the league, sports writers in every town, with no mean spirit intended, somebody would say to him in every town, Michael, I'm sorry to bring this up, but when you go out on the court every night, do you think about your dad? I hate to say this, Michael, but how's your dad's death affected this year? Yeah, that's like a little knife into him every time. He doesn't need to do that. I mean, the 2 a.m. airplane flights, the hotel rooms, the loneliness on the road. Jordan, if he could somehow just arrange to play 2.5 hours of basketball every day, I think he'd do it for the rest of his life. But the NBA, the way those guys live, it's the other 21.5 hours that are the hard part.
Pete, anything here other than what appears at face value that Michael Jordan says it's not what I want to do anymore?
No, I mean, if that's true, what he says, that he didn't want to do the 2.5, do everything else but the 2.5 hours of basketball, why didn't he retire after he cashed his first Nike check? I mean, certainly he's got nothing to prove anymore. I mean, we've got to believe what he says on face value until we learn anything differently. And I believe that he's fed up with people prying into his private life. I think that's a major factor, that he's fed up with the media. He showed that at the press conference. He was very bitter toward the media. It came out in many, many ways. And, then he said he bears no grudges, but he does have a lot of grudges. And I think that was a major factor.
What questions should we be asking tonight first? And secondly, what does this do to the NBA to lose this superstar?
Well, I think a logical, immediate question to ask is this a permanent retirement or just a much-deserved and very understandable sabbatical? I talked privately with Pete earlier tonight, and he's one of the few people I've spoken to who flatly rules out a Jordan return. I think it makes sense, and this is just speculation, not based on any sort of particular insight. It makes sense that he would step away for a period of time, maybe just until the spring.
For all the reasons we've said.
Yeah, for all the reasons we've said, for an accumulation of reasons that even a person so used to handling pressure as he can no longer deal with at the level he'd like to deal with it. But he comes back in the spring for the playoffs, or he comes back next year. The only athlete that I can think of remotely comparable to Michael Jordan who quit at the peak of his powers was Jim Brown, the great football player.
I've got one more, Bjorn Borg.
Yeah, I guess he did.
Yeah,
I guess he did. Not a team sports player. But if Larry Bird's back hadn't given out, he would have played longer. He wouldn't have played to the point of embarrassing himself, but there's a natural decline. Bird could have continued to play as a very, very good player, not quite at his previous peak.
But
Magic Johnson would have done the same. Magic wanted to play even after contracting the HIV virus. That was obvious. So maybe Michael's in a separate category.
Right. But if what Bob says is true, that he is worried about that skill going down, if he's away from the game for any length of time, then he really has to worry about the skill going down. Coming back against the kind of competition that's around today, he won't want to come back with the expectations that people will have when he comes back. That's why I think that he left the door open a little bit, but Magic made an impulsive decision when he retired from the game and has regretted it ever since. Michael was very carefully planned.
Do you think that he can resist coming back, knowing these players as you do, knowing the competitive spirit within them, knowing how much they love the game, and knowing how, for this kind of athlete, not to be able to exercise his skills has got to be, at some point, frustrating for him, because it's what they do best.
Yeah, but Michael's very special, I think, in his resolve, his temperament, his intelligence, demeanor, everything. And I think when he says something, he basically means it. I think there'll be moments when he'll regret it. But I also know that, for instance, Larry Bird is probably sitting someplace, and I pretty much know this for a fact, and saying, the days are long. I know the year that I was fired and from Cleveland. I mean, the phone doesn't ring, and you got all day. You work out for an hour or whatever you do, and there's no office to go to. It's a whole different deal.
But it went so quickly for the Cavaliers that year.
93 days. Ready to do it again. Right?
No, but so what are you saying, that he's going to be sitting at home and
Yes.
despite all the money, despite all the golf games, because he says I can get the same competition.
What am I going to do with my time? I think, and he's 30 years old. That's going to have to be addressed by him at some point.
Bob Greene, the lure to come back.
Yeah, it's the first image you get in your mind. Okay, now we're in October. What happens in January? Jordan's sitting at home. He turns on WGN in Chicago, and there's the Bulls playing the Atlanta Hawks and getting beat. What does he actually? I'd be interested in what. I mean, Coach Daly raised the question. I'd be interested in what he thinks of that, because you can't. Jordan mentioned he may come to the arena on some nights just to watch the Bulls play. I'm not sure what the effect of that will be. I mean, I'm not even sure what the effect will be opening night if Jordan goes to the ring ceremony and then either leaves or sits down in his business suit while these guys go out and play. I think it's going to get real complicated, because Michael Jordan inside the Chicago Stadium this year is going to be a reminder of something that's not present anymore.
Coach?
I have to address one thing, somewhat by accident. We were in Barcelona. We commandeered a helicopter, Julius, myself, and Michael, and
As in Urban and Jordan.
Jim Gray of CBS, and we went up to Mass now to play golf, where I had played with Payne Stewart and the week before. And it's an unbelievable golf course. We arrived, there wasn't a soul around, not a soul. We landed, we got in the cart, we started to play. We got to the 9th hole, and you'd have thought it was an anthill. I mean, they're coming out of the hills, they're running across the green. Then I got to the 17th hole, and I said, look, I love you. You know, you're great, you're fun to be around, but I just don't want to be around you because we can't play golf. We get to the helicopter and can't take off. They drape themselves over the runners. They try to get in the windows, and they basically wouldn't let us go. Then I started to get a real sense of how the guy lives. And I've been in Pinehurst and some other places with him. The guy needs time. But you know what? Bob and all of us, we'll welcome him back.
Yeah.
We will welcome him back because...
I mean, there may be a phone call to him tomorrow morning saying...
We will welcome him back.
You know, Charlie, this is just a feeling on my part, not based on any conversation with Michael. It's been exceptionally difficult to get in touch with him. Even his own coach, Phil Jackson, went weeks without getting a return call, understandably, this summer with the turmoil surrounding Michael's life. But my feeling is this, that Michael feels genuinely hurt by a lot of what's been said and written about him, and the notion goes something like this. Look, I'm not perfect, but I went out of my way to basically be a good guy. Sure, I made a lot of money in endorsements, and I became famous, and I benefited from who I was, but I went to a lot of charity deals, and I gave a lot of my money away, and I signed a lot of autographs, and I was nice to the little people, and I was accessible, at least at the beginning of my career, through most of it, to the press, and now I'm getting beat up out of all proportion. I'm a better guy than this. I don't deserve this. I happen to think that he, like any public figure, occasionally deserves criticism. It comes with the territory, and some of the scrutiny was warranted, but some of it was out of all proportion. And maybe the last straw was the totally irresponsible speculation after his father's death, in the absence of any specific evidence, that Michael's gambling activity could possibly have been related to this. It's one thing to have that cross your mind. It's quite another thing to have it show up on broadcasts and in print.
That same speculation has come out now as possibly a reason behind why he left. You know, did he tell...
Some stories about to come out, and by getting out, he avoids the discussion of it?
Well, you know, some people say that the investigation that David Stern was looking into his gambling, you know, did he tell David Stern that he was retiring, or did David Stern tell him he was retiring? You know, that kind of stuff is already being circulated around, though I haven't seen it in print yet. So he's right. It won't go away.
Bob Greene.
Something Bob Costas just said is very much to the point, which is Michael Jordan gets his feelings hurt. It seems like a simple concept because he seems to be so much above the rest of us in that area. I mean, he's under such scrutiny all the time that he seems to be able to shrug it off, but he doesn't. He gets his feelings hurt all the time, and you know, we talked once, and he said it's very much like the case of a comedian in a nightclub who's telling jokes before an audience full of people, and everybody's laughing and appreciating what he's doing, but one guy in the front row has got his arms crossed and is not laughing. That's who Jordan notices, and he said once that he tries so hard never to let anyone know that his feelings are hurt, because if he shows that he's hurt by something someone has said, he feels that person has defeated him. That person has somehow won a victory. And Jordan said he would rather keep it all inside and stare at the ceiling all night rather than let someone know. Now, for people who may not have that sensitive a nature, that may seem ridiculous. Hey, you're a public figure, it comes with the territory. Jordan happens to be the kind of person who every slight is noticed, and I think that has a lot to do with his reaction to so much that's gone on.
Bob, he never held back from me. Anytime that he didn't like a one-liner in my column when I was writing for USA Today, I'd see him the next time. He'd have a list of them. He'd make a complaint. He says, "Why are you always picking on me?" I said, "Hey, Michael," I said, "if I didn't like you, it wouldn't be one-liners. I'd be writing whole columns about you." I said, "I have to write something."
Some of the most vicious diatribes any of us have ever seen, by the way.
Some of them given to me off the record by you, I might say. The truth is now out.
What does the loss of Michael Jordan, Magic Johnson, Larry Bird to the NBA do to the NBA?
Well, the league has been set on the right track, largely because of those guys, so it's never going to reverse itself. but the graph, which was heading steadily up, 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 is going to taper off. It has to. This despite the Larry Johnsons, the Shaquille O'Neals, the Charles Barkleys. Jordan was the #1 figure in the modern history of team sports. He might have been the best player, but even if he wasn't, he was the #1 public figure for an athlete. And Johnson and Bird weren't far behind. It's unheard of. No team sport has had the 3 best players in its history playing simultaneously.
Yeah.
And 13 of the last 14 NBA Finals had 1 or 2 of those 3 players in them. Only 1990, when the Pistons played the Trailblazers, since '80, hasn't had Magic, Bird, or Jordan in it. It would be as if every World Series had Koufax pitching to Mantle. What would that mean to baseball? Every NBA Final had these guys or some combination of these guys in it for more than a decade. Now that's over.
The cliche is that the game is bigger than any one individual, but what does it mean to this game that you've spent so many years
I think very significantly to television. He's on national TV 17 times, 8 on NBC this year. A member of the Nets organization today indicated to me right off the top it cost them $1 million. Then you start looking at merchandising of Bulls equipment, which has skyrocketed over the years. There are significant factors, but the league will continue. We've lost our mystical people. We lost 3 very mystical people in basketball, and very not only great players, but for the right reasons, and they were above it all. Now we've got to redevelop. We've got some people and try to develop more stars.
See, I don't think Jordan was essentially in the business of basketball. I think the difference between Jordan and everybody else is Jordan is in the business of making people happy. You didn't have to know anything about basketball. You didn't have to know the rules. This guy, you could go out there on a winter night and watch this guy, and somehow that winter night became less cold, and that's what he was doing. 82 nights every winter, Jordan would go out there, and all around the country, parents would bring their children, young children, to see Jordan just so they could say to those kids years later, you saw Michael Jordan play basketball. And that's what you can't as an athletic league build or somehow develop. I mean, it's Costas and I have talked about this a lot, and it sounds goofy to say it, but I do believe it. About 3 times a century, somebody comes along. I think of Babe Ruth in 1927, and Elvis Presley in 1956, and Jordan these last few years. There's almost a chemical connection with the public, and you can't explain it, and you can't teach it, but it's just there. And that's why him stepping away today is not like a great athlete in the National Football League or Major League Baseball retiring. It's something you can't quite explain, but you know it's missing all of a sudden.
Muhammad Ali isn't going to like being left out of that group. but talking about the league and where it's going, I mean, the league has already been set. They've come up with Dream Team 2, having a lot of the new faces on that team that are the future of the NBA, Mourning and Hardaway, and Pepsi-Cola allows Shaquille O'Neal to play. He'll play. We don't know if Pepsi-Cola will allow O'Neal to be the next Michael Jordan. They're holding a lot of leverage right now.
For the sake of perspective, this growth is almost unheard of in team sports. Barely a decade ago, the NBA had its finals on tape delay at midnight.
With Magic Johnson?
With Magic Johnson and Dr. J, the 76ers and the Lakers in 1980, tape delay. The next year, Houston with Moses Malone and Larry Bird's Celtics, tape delay. All around the country on the late sportscast, you had sportscasters saying, I'm going to hold up the score now. If you plan to watch the game, don't look at this. But I won't say it out loud. In less than a decade, the 3 guys, and maybe Jordan with all the marketing was the most important of the 3 ultimately, led them to this point. Even with those 3 gone, I agree with Peter and with Chuck, the league is at a certain level. It's been set right. And we may look back, almost certainly will look back on this period of the 80s and early 90s as the greatest period for the NBA, but there's a certain level it will not dip beneath because it's been set on the right path.
All right. Let me just, I want to raise this question before I talk about sort of the individual greatness of Michael Jordan, both as in the ways we've talked about, but also as a performer on the court. What does this say about the way our society, sort of a big, broad philosophical question about the way we worship athletes and the pressure we bring to bear about them? Because Michael Jordan said today, he said, you began to look, the press, at my personal and private life because I'd proven everything there was to prove on the basketball court, and you sort of had nothing else to say about that. Give me feet what you think about what this says about us, not the press, but generally our obsession with superstars and our need to know everything about them and speculate about everything.
Well, that's how big it's gotten. It is big business. That was a definite knock on the media again. I mean, he came after the media big time today and then denies that there's anything personal, but there is. I thought it was significant that two out of the three networks went with this live. NBC did a half-hour special sending their main guy down, Brokaw, down there to do it, and then finishes with 5 minutes of Somalia. By the way, folks, we just lost 20 more Rangers in.
It was the second story on ABC, and I don't know where it was on CBS. It got high play on the evening news, whatever that means.
That's pretty tragic to me.
What does it say about our society and our worship of athletes and individual achievement?
I think generally speaking, the way we view sports has gotten greatly out of whack, and this comes from somebody who obviously very much enjoys sports, but I think the way we view it is out of proportion. That having been said, Michael Jordan is a once-in-a-lifetime type athlete and personality, so in almost any time he would have been special. And I think when he gets a little distance from this, he's going to be able to make a distinction between that portion of the press and the public that tried to pry unfairly into his private life and inappropriately and tried to exploit him, as Richard Esquinas tried to exploit him, and those who, even though they admired and respected Michael Jordan, had to occasionally criticize him because it comes with the territory, even as they praised him most of the time, and had to sometimes ask tough questions, such as about his gambling activity. That wasn't a case of prying into a celebrity's private life. Gambling has always been an issue when it comes to sports. It cost Pete Rose's career, cost Lenny Dykstra a probationary period when Fay Vincent hit him with a penalty when there was still a commissioner of baseball, Paul Hornung, Alex Karras. Now, that's not to say that Jordan did the same thing that those people did, but you get a red light when it comes to gambling, and Michael needs to understand that there was a certain amount of scrutiny associated with that was legitimate and was not a case of just prying into a celebrity's private life.
We totally disagree on this. We have been for months that I don't think they had any right to pry into it because there are no laws against what he did. He gambled, he lost, it was his money, no problem. Owners are allowed to do the same thing in the NBA. Coaches are allowed to go to Vegas during the season and gamble. I've seen Chuck at the tables once or twice at the horse races. I mean,
Never.
First, you know what the fact of the matter is?
We don't know how much he lost.
I lost 4 quarters last time I was there.
It's thrown around glibly that Jordan did no illegal gambling. The fact of the matter is, the kind of gambling for those sorts of stakes on golf courses would be illegal technically in most states. Would be illegal in most states. Prosecutors wouldn't move on it in most cases. But if you're getting up into hundreds of thousands of dollars,
it becomes illegal when it passes a certain monetary value.
Not when it passes a certain monetary value. Common sense tells you that if it gets to a certain level and if it became common knowledge, that the authorities would move to squelch it. It's not strictly legal. It really isn't strictly legal. It's just something that prosecutors have better things to do than pursue usually.
It's not illegal. Nobody's ever said it is illegal. I mean, you can't tell me it's illegal.
But do you think he has a problem or not?
I think potentially he could. I don't know. I mean,
how would I know? Is it a legitimate question?
How would I know?
Is it a legitimate question in your judgment?
Only if we find out that he's gambling on games. Then it's a legitimate question.
Here's why I think it became a festering question. The league didn't set forth its position. Suppose David Stern had come out and said the following: we view this differently than the NFL or than baseball. We respect their position. Our position is this. Gambling on the part of any of our players we discourage as a matter of the league's advice, but we take no action against it unless specifically there's evidence that there's been betting on NBA games. Anything else, we don't care about. If Stern had said that...
But that is their position.
But he never flatly said that. He never flatly staked that position.
He might not have come out.
He said there would be an ongoing investigation.
This conversation is part of the reason he's
NBC.
gone.
Would you do this on NBC?
We have done it on NBC.
Before I go, tell me how good he was. The best to ever play the game?
I heard Bob Ryan this morning. He said arguably
Bob
the
Ryan,
best.
sports writer with Boston Globe?
Arguably the best, the best I've seen.
You say that in Boston, don't you?
I mean, he is.
Why quote Bob Ryan? You're much more
spectacular player. We were playing Marshall Airness very quickly in a very key game. I was concerned about the game because he'd gotten everybody else in foul trouble.
Yeah.
And so I mentioned it that morning. He only played 27 holes that day. He went out and spaced them perfectly. But when you're with that level of player sitting on the bench, you realize the level at which he can play. And I think you want to get into the gambling and all aspects of his life. His late father put it best. Everything is about competitiveness with him.
Joe Dumars once said to me, he's just in another zone. Said he's never, you're a guy. Where does he stand? The best? I mean, what was the best about him?
The best ever. I think his legacy should be that he had more pressure on him than anybody because he had to come to the arena every night and outperform himself. And he did it. Yeah. He'd win the game.
He said, I reached the pinnacle of my career. I don't have anything else myself to prove. Bob, how good? Where do you put him?
Hallelujah.
Well, when you talk about the all-time greats, maybe you need to separate out centers. It's hard to compare what Chamberlain and Kareem and Bill Russell did with Bird, Johnson, Jordan. Those are probably the three best players who weren't centers. Jordan is probably the best collection of basketball skills. He was also the most competitive player in the league.
Magnetic, probably.
He had it all. I don't think you could rank him above Bird and Johnson in terms of being a winner. Bird and Johnson each would have won more titles if they didn't have to compete against each other. So I think he's at the same level as they are in terms of contributing to a championship. But in terms of individual skills, he's the best guy.
He played offense and defense, which nobody else did. And they played at sea level, and he played above the squalor.
Yeah. He redefined the game.
He redefined the game. Yeah. The interesting thing I saw in what he said today, and I read this from his comments, he said, I guess the biggest gratification, I'm a very optimistic person, I guess the biggest positive thing that I can take out of my basketball game, and that means a lot, it was something that we, my family and me, have talked about for a long time. He goes on to say that his father saw me my last basketball game, and that means a lot to him. Somehow that rang when I read this, that his father had seen him play his last game. His father was now gone, somehow connected to me as having some meaning. I don't know if it did, but that's it. I thank all of you for joining us.
Thank you, Charles.
Bob Costas, and Joe what's his name is going to be the former coach of the Redskins is going to be working with you.
Joe Gibbs.
Joe Gibbs.
Joe, how quickly they forget. The guy won 3 Super Bowls. He's right. Joe, what's his name?
He's now in the stock car business, right? He's in racing. And look what happened to the Redskins.
Thank you, Arsenio.
Anytime, Chevy. Thank you, Pete. Great to have you. Thank you, Coach. Look forward to it. From Chicago, Bob Greene, thank you very much. I know how close you were. And will continue to be to Michael Jordan. We will be back in just a moment. Stay with us. Michael Jordan. In retirement, I thank the people who joined me today to share an appreciation and a remembrance and an evaluation of what he may be doing. We ask you now to take a look at some of his brilliance on the court as the credits roll. See you tomorrow night, Billy Joel.